I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again today. I know I said it last week, but I just want to give a huge thank you again to all of you who have gone out and read my new book, Resolute. It's been frankly incredible to hear what you're taking away from it and what stands out to you most as well. So again, if you get the chance to read it, please let me know what you think, because I always love hearing your feedback. But look, pivoting back to the podcast, earlier this month, March 13th, was actually National Canine Veterans Day, where people celebrate and commemorate the service that military dogs do across the world. And I actually just found out about this day, and I think it's really amazing that we have it, because these dogs, they play a huge role in protecting and rescuing soldiers, sniffing out narcotics and explosives, all while being fiercely loyal to their handlers. And last week, I had the incredible opportunity to speak to one of these Marine Corps canine handlers, retired Sergeant Alfred Brenner, who told me what it was like forming an incomparable bond with his military dog named Grief, and how they went from butting heads in training to becoming best friends who served in Afghanistan together. Unfortunately, Sergeant Brenner and Grief were in Afghanistan in 2010 when they were struck by an IED. After they were thrown into the air, Sergeant Brenner was sure he was dead, but luckily he was wrong. Though he was severely injured, Sergeant Brenner survived that day, but unfortunately Grief, who had taken the brunt of the hit, did not. Today, Sergeant Brenner tells me about how he recovered not only from his physical injuries, but from the most excruciating pain he suffered that day. Not being able to come home with Grief, a name that Alfred says was the worst choice for the best dog. So thank you again for joining, and I hope that you are just as touched by Sergeant Brenner and Grief's story as I was.
The first day at canine school, it was just the barking and the thunderous, roar of all those aggressive dogs. And, it kind of shattered me to my core. Like, what did I get myself into? So you get through all the basics, you learn how to handle the dog. It's a huge learning experience. But then when you go to your base, you get attached to the dog that you're going to spend your time with. They do a pairing program where they try to put your personalities together, handling techniques. They try to fit what best dog works with you. And then long story short, that we kind of shuffled some dogs around, and I wound up becoming paired with Grief. And I can tell you wholeheartedly that it took several months to almost years before I could actually trust him. Because again, I was learning everything for the first time. I didn't know what leash manipulation was. I didn't know that emotions run down leash. So the more anxious and nervous I was, the more anxious and nervous he was. Where I just thought he didn't like me or he was a dumb dog. But it was this whole, they talk about the bond between the animal. And that's why it's so important, because unless you understand each other's little quirks and, you get that trust, that's where it really saves lives, is that bond between each other.
What was Grief trained for? Was it bomb disposal? And then sort of how many different roles would there be for dogs in the military?
Yeah, so we have several different types of dogs. Grief particularly was a dual-purpose dog. He was called a PED, which is a patrol explosive detector dog. So he was trained to attack. You do the basic commands, setting them on a bite, the stuff you'd see on cops, the dogs running up, jumping into the police car. But then we also do explosive detection, which that was our bread and butter, because overseas, you might have an instance where you'd have to, detain somebody or pursue an individual. But most of the threat was IEDs on the ground. So a lot of the dogs we deployed with were bomb dogs. We also had 2 drug dogs that went over their seas with us. That was really a deterrent, for our guys, if whether smuggling or even just other people putting things on base. And we also have tracker dogs. So tracker dogs, were primary purpose was to track individuals. If they laid an IED, they'd go into a site and then follow them to gather intel and to try to apprehend that person. Now, as things evolved, what the military did, which was a very unique and creative thing, is they created the multi-purpose canine, which is an MPC. Now, these are the dogs that you would see, on the helos going in to see Osama bin Laden and a lot of special operations groups use. And these dogs have all these capabilities wrapped into one.
Those are the ones that sort of jump out of the
yes
together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Grief, I felt like was going to fall out of a helicopter, but no, we were not qualified to jump out of one. That's for sure.
Was it Belgian Malinois?
Yes, that's one of the primary dogs we use due to their ability to do things physically that a shepherd may not be able to do. Obviously, shepherds are very smart; they have great noses, but the Belgian Malinois is one that we primarily try to use based off of their agileness and their longevity in working, their good sizes. And then we had other dogs down the road, like we'd have a string of labs, that would do strictly detection work. It's very rare you'd see a lab go up and bite somebody. We'd have hounds and different types of dogs, your Czech shepherds, but yeah, those are the two primary ones that we use.
But with the Belgian Malinois, I mean, they're working dogs. As far as I get it, they really want to be achieving something, that they need to go out and do something. And it's interesting because can they also be pets? So can you both have a dog that is out there, it is, it might have to stop someone, it is working, and then can come home and also sort of be, I was going to say affectionate to you, but also be a friend?
I say yes. I think all dogs have the capability of love and, being able to sit on the couch and watch a movie with you. However, I think the only instances I've ever seen that is with these experienced handlers who have the ability to adopt their dog. You'll see them, posting videos of them hanging out or taking a walk in the park, but you'll see it throughout the dog community. Most trainers across the board will say, these are the top 5 breeds that you should never get. And that one always kind of hits the list.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very, very difficult to handle. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be house pets. However, just like any weapon, it depends on who's holding that gun. So that's pretty much how we look at it.
I've got to ask about the name. I mean, who called him Grief?
I'd love to meet that person. Yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, we joked forever because he didn't want to listen to one word I told him. I'd say sit, and he'd stare at me. I didn't know if it was typical, stubbornness, or he was a bad dog. If it was his name, where we tried Griff or anything, like all these weird names because we knew he was from Germany. But it was a strange name. And then, obviously, as time went on, things happened and, our story unfolded. And lo and behold, it was just kind of something that was meant to be. But I have no idea. I always say it was the worst dog name we've ever heard. And it kind of is, it's horrible. I think it's because he caused so much grief to the trainers that they just said, just call him Grief. Give it to the next guy.
Yeah, man. It's funny because I wonder, you would assume that the best dog would be a really high energy dog that's out there, but maybe that's not necessarily true. Maybe sometimes, depending on the circumstance, you want sort of do you ever want a calm dog in operations? Or
I think there's a difference between a dog who can be well-mannered and not high-strung, but also have that drive. There's dogs who may be like this teddy bear who's this love bug who you're never going to get bit, or like Snap. But as soon as you say go search, it'll just be out to the races and just 100% nose to the ground because they have that love to work. It's like if you take a ball and you throw it for your dog at home. He might be laying on the couch watching a movie, but as soon as you throw it, he's all amped up and ready to go. They have that switch. And then there's dogs who can't turn it off. There's dogs that are just, as soon as you hook them up, they're crazy and salivating, and so there is a difference, but I think drive is the most important, and that's different than overactivity or their personality in general.
More of our conversation right after this. Can you tell me what happened in 2010? You were injured, and what happened to Grief?
Yeah, so we went through most of our deployment. Typically, handlers go for a 6-month deployment, like most Marines. We were out there for almost to the 5-month mark, and we were actually working with the Army at the time in Kandahar. We were supporting this big operation, it was Operation Dragon Strike. We were clearing out this whole area to basically push out individuals and to help progress, in war efforts. So we were out searching. It was a very long day. I didn't have the credit of it, but our unit, coupled with another Marine unit and Afghan Army, were finding IEDs left and right. It was just one of those times where they just kept popping up. There was an instance where we were sitting next to an explosion that went off just hours before ours. We were right on top of it. Unfortunately, someone lost their life and there was other injuries. Grief was shooken like crazy. I think that was the end of his deployment, but we pushed on. And, we still had a job to do. As long as we were both still breathing, it felt like we had our expertise to handle. We came to this other building, and as we got up to it, the doors are all locked, and, we're trying to break into this building to secure it for the night. And the two gentlemen I'm with, and I was actually standing next to the highest ranking officials in our unit. I don't know how that was even possible, but it was like the sergeant major, the captain, the ex-CO of the unit, me, and their medic. And as we're trying to get into this building, he's ripping this door down, and I turned around to go approach the sergeant major, who happened to break in the building himself. So he was walking back towards us. I was going to report to him to hand him back his rifle, and after 3 steps, an IED detonated and wound up, making me feel like I was flying through the air. And I thought I was dead, of course. I know what IEDs do to people. And based on how I was feeling, I just knew that was it. But then I was just flipping stopped. I started to hear voices. They patched me up a little bit. And then that's the moment that I realized I lost my best bud, because they had to call in a 9 line, and it was 1 wounded and 1 killed. And everybody I was with was still around. So it didn't make much sense. And as I'm laying there, I realized nobody was calling his name. Nobody was helping him. Nobody was addressing his needs. And that's where it hit me. Of course, I wasn't affected by it emotionally because of everything you're dealing with. That comes later. But that's what severely injured me and killed grief. And then they got me out of there. They flew me to Bagram first, did the initial analysis, and then I was sent to Germany. I was in Launcesville, Germany for about a week. And then from there, was able to get to the States to see my family for the next 33 days.
Talk to me then about what that was like when you had some moments to understand how you were feeling, and you knew that grief, you thought about grief having passed away.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. It was like we had this strong bond, and it was like every day we were together. And I obviously felt it on the ground where I knew he wasn't there. But just like the first stage of grief, it's denial. You just don't believe it. It doesn't affect you. It's not real. I was very blessed with the opportunity to be very distracted by surgeries and in and outs and, all these progressions in my recovery that I never had to really think about it. And then maybe subconsciously I didn't want to. I think it was a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later, my wife was able to get me an iPad. It was the first generation, the old blocky one. And the only thing I was able to do was move my finger. My hands were all bandaged up and I was pretty incapacitated. And as I'm scrolling through the glass on Facebook, I could see a picture that was posted of me in grief. And there was hundreds of comments and people saying stuff. And then as soon as I saw that picture, I immediately broke down and started crying. That was the first time it hit me that my buddy wasn't there anymore. And I must have felt like I cried for hours. And then from there on, it was just like this process of like constantly coming up where I thought, wow, what would have happened if he wasn't there? Or maybe he's still all right. You just play these games in your head. But that was the first moment. It didn't happen for a little while. And it was an immense pain. And to be honest with you, it was the first real loss I've ever experienced. I've lost grandparents as a young kid, but early adulthood, having a very strong bond with somebody was the first real loss I've ever experienced. And I realize what people go through now with, those things.
At what point did you think, or at any point did you think, I want to get back, I want to continue this and have another dog and get back into this? Or did you feel, though, that with grief gone, that it would be hard to sort of replicate that?
I think it was a combination of everything. As I was laying there in the hospital, I actually had a roommate. One of my roommates was a Marine Special Operations captain. He lost both of his legs. And he asked me, do you want to go? He's like, you ready to go back, buddy? And I'm like, I'll be honest. I don't know if I want to go back there. It was like, I feel like it was something that I did and I was able to make it out alive. Why go back? But this gentleman was built very differently. He actually deployed again with no legs. He has that warrior mentality. Again, too, I didn't know what I would do without my dog. So it was like, if I was able to get back to being healthy again, what would that look like? How would I be able to replicate that? I don't think I could ever redo it better than I did. I always suffered with feelings of failure. Like, did I do something wrong? You have these guilt feelings of, if I did it again, is it going to happen again? All these different things. And physically, I wasn't able to handle a dog. So the canine world is very physical, and I wasn't able to do that during my time in the service. So my only option was to stay in and do like a desk job or, bounce around doing that. So I wasn't able to handle a dog anymore. But I did decide, instead of kind of riding out the whole recovery thing, my goal was to get better as fast as possible and then make it to my unit again. I was able to go back to California and kind of become the training NCO. I wanted to be around and share my knowledge, tell the other guys basically, don't do this, tell them the things that I've experienced overseas so that they can understand, what it's like and not feel it like I did the first time.
What would you really have been teaching them and telling them? Like, if you said, don't do this or don't do that, what were you really trying to pass on?
So what I did was, a couple of the things that I've implemented was these training things were things that I've experienced. Like, one big example that stuck out to me was we had an incident where a vehicle blew up, and unfortunately it took the lives of the driver. And I had to do a secondary explosion, a post-blast search up to it. And what I realized was that it's not just the explosive odor that's all over the place and disturbed dirt and everything else. You'll experience body parts all over the place. And that was something very difficult to search through. So I tried to emulate that as much as possible stateside. I had this training where I made it look like there's body parts everywhere. I threw food everywhere. I made it look like brains, unfortunately. And to me, that was very hard to see just emotionally, not alone just physically searching. And I wanted to express to them that, like, I want you to experience these things here. So over there, it's not like it's the first time you've seen it. That was like the biggest thing that stood out for me.
Yeah. I remember I was at a suicide bombing in Baghdad, and I remember afterwards they were going up and down the street, the Iraqi bomb squad, picking up, bags, black bags of just body parts that were everywhere, fat and fingers, and I remember also just hadn't thought about it, never crossed my mind that's what it would be like.
Right, and it doesn't seem real. It's you see it in movies, but when you see it in real life, it doesn't seem real. It just looks like something in your brain can't process it, I think, so.
You think you can ever really process that? You've seen things like that, and is it still with you? Did it change you?
I think that, and I can understand where, like, people who have, like, they work in the ER or EMTs, especially firefighters. I think that you have to grow a heart of stone and a thick skin. That's the only way we were able to get through deployments. A lot of these guys who saw way more action than me, the only way you process it if you kind of record it and then put it in the back of your brain where you never have to experience it again. And I think that's why down the road it comes back up in these weird moments. That's exactly what PTSD is, where you might see something that reminds you of it, and now the next thing you know, you're in a different place. To me, I don't think it affected me initially, and I was able to kind of, through faith and everything else, kind of process this and move on, knowing that this is just part of, I guess, life. This is what we're bred to do. So that's how I got through it. I've never experienced it. If I saw a piece of hamburger meat on the stove, I'm not like, oh, I freak out. But I can understand where it definitely messes with people.
Faith is a really interesting one, because did you ever ask, you sadly, you've seen, colleagues of yours die out there. And did you ever sort of ask yourself, why would God have allowed my friend to lose their lives? Why shouldn't God be protecting us while we're out here? And did those questions come up?
All the time. I think it was initially, I was very blessed through my first month or two of deployment where nothing really happened. We experienced little things, but nothing as bad as grief or death. Then we got a call that my good friend Max Donahue was killed. He was the first dog handler killed in Afghanistan, and we all had to come back for his memorial. And that was the first sense of loss as far as like someone that we have a great relationship with. And I have a whole chapter in my book where initially it was called Why. It was called Why, God, Why? I just questioned everything, like why? And then I even write about it, I never really realized there won't be an answer to that. You won't know until you're face to face and, you realize you made it to the end of your life and this is what you had to live for. The only thing that we could justify was that even though he was gone, we also had a responsibility to continue his legacy, to continue our work. If we're breathing, we need to still do our work. There was no crawling into a hole and, just becoming super depressed with the idea that he's not here. But the question of why constantly came up, and that transition, that pivot in our deployment was, I can't be afraid anymore, because he taught me that even in death, you still live on through the lives around you that you've impacted. You were able to impact us so much that we won't stop. We'll continue to push through. And I think that was the biggest thing that changed the tone of the deployment. So I wasn't questioning why anymore. It was just like, how, God, how can I make this work? How can I keep pushing forward? You don't live in fear anymore when you have those feelings in it. So that was a very profound moment.
Yeah, you talk in the book about how to push forward as well. I wonder, did you see people react in different ways around you? So some people who kind of bottled it up, kept it inside, and they just end up becoming straight into sort of depression, versus the other people who managed to get through it, talking to other people about it and being open. And I think there are two different kinds of people, some who crumble or not crumble, can't handle it, and others who can. What makes the difference? Like, why can some people get through things like that and other people can't?
I think it has a lot to do with who that individual is. I think people dismiss a lot about their upbringing. I know a lot of times people blame things on their life about their upbringing, but I think it's from very early stages of your life, how you're able to push through the smallest adversities, whether you're a child or losing a baseball game or, you try to just push through. And I think I was always that particular person. Now, the thing that I want to share is that I've constantly struggle. I struggle to this day, with feelings of failure and feelings of, regret. Like, what if I stayed in, because I got out pretty soon and I bought into the whole wounded warrior mentality, so this book has been a process. This wasn't something I just woke up and said I'm going to do. It was a constant process. And I'd say I go through these waves of just success, and then failure, success, and failure. And I've learned that you have to talk about it. I reached out to these guys trying to recount stories and say, hey, I'm going to write about you in the book. Is this okay? And then I tell them what I was going to write, and they say, I don't remember that. Like, I can't believe that. I kind of forgot that happened, whether they did that on purpose or it was just they moved on with their life. And it's been very cathartic for not just those individuals, but guys from the Vietnam era or even farther. They started to remember things just based off of someone else sharing. And I think that goes with the whole concept of, AA meetings or any of these group community functions where people can, share and then feel like a sense of community, because we all strive to feel not only wanted, but accepted too. And if it feels like this is an acceptable thing to share, you can release that burden. And I still struggle with it every day. I'm still trying to figure out what God's purpose was me in my life. Why am I still living? What am I supposed to do? And I think this was just a small portion of that, is trying to open doors for people.
Is it perhaps sort of making sure that you find that purpose? That life must be used to either help direct or, help those people who are struggling. And is that something that you really want to try and help with?
I believe so. Like I said, I hate using this, especially in this economic climate. But it's kind of hard to go to these areas. I wish I could just volunteer my time all the time, but it's tough. I'm struggling with. I need a job. There's things I physically can't do. I fell in love with the canine world. I can't do that. My lack of experience. So there's just all these things, these internal battles. But I would love to sit in a room with people all day and help them with their problems. Talking in front of large groups, because if I'm sure you talk to 1,000 people, even if 5 walk away feeling that emotional connection, you did your job, and that's a very powerful thing, to be able to connect with people. I think that's very important. Aside from that, I'm not so sure else why I'm here, because interestingly enough, I was able to recount every part of the explosion. I was conscious for the whole thing. And I think that's what made this so interesting. Because in therapy, they said, write down what happened if you can. And second by second, I remembered all the feelings. I remember the conversations. And I think that was a blessing in disguise, because it allowed me to share, what other people can't recount. A lot of people wake up in Germany, and don't really remember. And that could be to protect them. I think God put this on me to basically say, here, I'm going to let you remember it all, because you're strong enough to share it.
We'll be back in a moment with Searching for Heroes. Do you find sometimes, I find this myself, that it seems much easier to talk to other people and tell other people how to get through tough moments and how to pull themselves together than perhaps it is to actually sometimes do it to yourself? Do you ever find that?
Absolutely. I think it's, when you have the support and, of either therapists, doctors, or your loving family, it's very easy to kind of get caught up in this motivation of like, okay, I'm going to push for you. And then after a while you realize, okay, I'm here, but like, how did I get here? You kind of skip through the whole processing it yourself. And you definitely kind of blindside yourself. You cheapen yourself of like these internal wins, I guess. At least that's how I felt. But yeah, and then you're like, oh, I'm able to walk again. So now what? And then you get to the top of the hill and everything's easy, and then you don't have that push and that drive anymore. So you definitely have these waves. I say I go through these waves, and I'm sure you can attest to this. Initially, when you're driven to do something to get back to your family or to like become healthy again, it's honestly easy. It was easy for me to push in the hospital and be motivated, not just lay there and go, oh, I don't want to do this, But then when you get to the point of normal, whatever that is, you're like, where do I do now? The next best challenge.
That's so funny, because I just released a book last week, and I've been
congratulations. I saw that. Yeah.
Thank you. But I have been talking in that about that exact feeling. I was in Bamsi, San Antonio, and that was the easiest part. I was there for 6-7 months, and easy. I know what I'm doing. I'm going home. I will walk. I will figure it out. And I thought that when I went home that I'd achieved it. No, the tough parts came afterwards. The pressure on the family, the things I couldn't do, having to go out, figure out your work, figure out other things. And that was what totally surprised me. I didn't know that was going to be the tough part. And you're spot on.
absolutely right. And like I said, that's why I brought it up that I'm struggling with it today. I don't think it ever goes away. It's definitely a process, but people don't realize it. And then they congratulate you and you get the slap on the back, you get the parades and all the pomp and circumstance. And then it's like, well, great. And then it's like, okay, good luck in the world, figure it out.
I was actually asked to speak at this resilience, get together this resilience initiative. And I was sitting at this table in DC last year, and everyone was talking about how resilient I was and what I'd gone through. And I sat inside. Couldn't have felt further from that. I felt totally sort of broken. And I'm sitting in this room and I'm thinking, if they had any idea that right now is just, I couldn't be further from feeling resilient. But everyone just keeps saying, look what you've got through. It's so great. I think that will forever be a sort of this, this difficult division, this split, which is hard.
Yes, I don't know if we'll ever get rid of that. And I think that's probably the hardest part of I tell people all the time, getting blown up is easy. That instance happened like that. I didn't ask for it. Pushing through the pain was easy. And it's like, what's the next thing that's I'm going to have to tackle in my life? And I think that's the burden that we have to accept. I think that's what I'm learning as I go through these trials and tribulations,
So that's the bigger question then is, are we just trying to reach this point where we don't have the ups and downs, or do we just accept that there will be ups and downs and that's okay? Like, how do we solve the parts that no one's really noticing?
I think it would be, like you said, it's, going back to the community, the circles, the sharing, the stories we're sharing in large groups. I think, like you said, I think instead of us talking about how awesome we are to getting the point of reintegrating back into society or making it through adversity, injuries, it's more about accepting those ups and downs. Like, if you feel like a failure, it's going to be okay, but it's not okay to accept that. It's okay to say, I failed or I feel this way. Now push yourself and get back up. That's, I think, the real part of the story, not from the explosion upwards. It's really the downfall that I think we all really need to kind of project. At least that's where I'm getting to now, is like, my story is about us surviving Afghanistan, and then a little bit after when I got hurt. But now I'm realizing, as you mentioned in your second book, is that it's actually a lot more than that. It's an ever-ending story. So I think that the real message has to be, it's okay to fail, but now climb higher than you were before. It's kind of like a false summit. You climb up a mountain and the view's a little beautiful, but you realize there's a higher peak. So you have to go down in the valleys again, and then you have to go back up, and there might be some water and some mud, but there will always be a higher purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think now that the what I think is real resilience is not that things are going to be easy all the time. It's knowing that when things are tough, that you will get to the good on the other side. That if you just keep going, you will get to the higher peak, and so not let the troughs really hold you down. Bringing it back to grief again, do you still talk to grief, chat to him, and do you have a dog at the moment?
So I do. I have. Well, we have dogs. Our whole time as relationship. We got a golden retriever when we first got married off the Penny Saver in California. This cute little dog. Obviously since passed away. That was tough. And then we had another shepherd. I actually got a shepherd shortly after grief passed. We you always go through these grieving stages where you're like, I'll never see a dog again, and then 2 months later you're like, at the breeder or something, or at the pound. So I got a shepherd. Even tried the couple names. We even tried grief because he responded immediately to it. And then he looked right at me and I'm like, okay, that's weird. And then, I'm not going to push that on him. So we had a dog named Diesel. He became my service dog. I was actually able to train him to be my service dog. And I would take him to different, talks, and anywhere I went, I would always have him. And he was huge with my healing process, because that's what I had overseas, was grief attached to me 24 hours a day. So being able to just walk him out into a store just really made me feel whole again. That was that missing piece that I had. And he passed away about a year ago. He was 12. So, but now we have two now. We have a golden and a mixed Aussie breed. Real cute. But yeah, I do. I'll be on a walk, whether it's with another dog or by myself, and I'll always envision Grief walking down. It's hard to just picture him doing it because he was always out in front, searching the roadways. And I would just have these images of him always around me, and I would just kind of pop up. And I think about it all the time. It's those things, like you said, you go through waves of it. It might be more profound memories that pop up, for whether it's smells, sounds, anything. But it'll never go away. And I think that's the most important part of grief, is that it's not something bad that you need to eradicate from your life. It's something you need to live with. If you hold on to it, because grief just shows you how much you love something. So if you ignore it, you kind of prove that you don't love him. So that's what he's always going to be a part of me through this whole journey.
Yeah. Well, look, Al, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Like, I really greatly appreciate it. And I just, let's keep fighting the fight, man. The ups and the downs will always be there. And I know that, if you can get through the downs, life's a great place.
Absolutely. Yes. And congratulations on Resolute. Hopefully it does well. I know it just came out, right?
It just came out. We actually a New York Times bestseller yesterday. So
congratulations!
Done really well. But it's funny. That's my second book, which is exactly what you were describing. The first book was about what happened. The second book was the reality that things are going to be harder moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations again, and thank you again for this opportunity. This has been a great conversation, so I appreciate it a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Al. Great to meet you.
Yes, you too, sir.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.